Hello and welcome to another session of Excel Programming for Clinicians with me, Dlorton Callum. In this session, I will introduce you to subroutines and functions. Now, you've already been using subroutines, perhaps without realizing it. However, so far, all of our code to solve a particular problem has been contained in single subroutines. So first, we'll look at how to write code that does the same thing over and over again, but without using subroutines. We will then look at how to improve our code by using subroutines. Finally, I'll take a look at user-defined functions, which are used in a similar way to subroutines, but which have the advantage of being able to return a result that we can use later on in our program. Okay, so here is a scenario we're going to use to demonstrate the use of subroutines and functions. So we've been given an Excel form to fill. We want to fill in the patient hospital number, name and date of birth, height, weight, and BMI. Now, the data could come from anywhere. So here is a list of patients. At the moment, we only have one patient, but you could imagine this could be hundreds or even thousands of patients. And this data could come from a database or it could come from a file that you've imported. But the task is to fill one form for every patient. So we want to pull this data from this list and use it to fill our form. First, let's take a look at how you do that without the use of subroutines. Let's start by getting the hospital number. To get the hospital number, because it's in the data sheet, we need to use our sheets object and select the one called data. That will bring us to this sheet. And then with that, we need to use our range object to select cell A2. Now we have selected cell A2, we need to use the selection object copy method. That copies it to the clipboard. We then use our sheets object again, this time selecting our exercise sheet. That brings us back to this sheet. And now we want to select cell C4. So here I can use my active sheets object, range property. Remember, anytime we say range object without specifying which sheet, we're actually choosing the active sheet object. So with that range selected, I can call another property, another method of active sheets, which is the paste method. Okay, so that should copy my hospital number from my data sheet to the patient management system. Let's run that code and see what we get. Great, so that worked, and we now have the hospital number, but we need to do the same for all the other items of data. So let's copy this code. Let's paste it below, and this time let's copy the surname. Now you'll notice the steps are more or less the same. We switch over to our data sheet. We select a range. In this case, it will be B2. We then copy the data in that range. We switch over to the exercises sheet. And with the exercise sheet, we select C6. And we paste. Let's do the same for all the other data items. Starting with forename. Again, forename comes from C2 and it goes to C8. Okay, let's do the same for date of birth. Date of birth comes from D2 and it goes to C10. Next, we want the height. Copy this code, paste it below, and height goes from E2 to C12. Finally, let's get the weight. Weight goes from F2 to C13. Now, at the end of all that, Excel will be in cut, copy, paste mode. So let's change that. Let's change the cut, copy mode to false. Okay, so now, provided I haven't made any mistakes, that should fill the form with the data from our data sheet. Let's run the code and see what we get. And there we go. We filled out our patient management system with data derived from our data sheet. Now, that seemed to work beautifully. So what is wrong with this code? Why am I not happy with it? Well, anytime you find yourself writing the same lines of code over and over again, but only changing one or two items, then that's a signal to you that your code is not optimized, that there might be a better way of doing it. What we want to do is write this code only once. Imagine if we had 30, 40, even 50 data items we wanted to copy over. The chances of us making a mistake will be high. And then if we need to make a change, we need to make that change in 40 or 50 different data items. So how can we improve this? Let's take a look at how we write this code with the use of subroutines. Now, what we're doing with each block of code that we've had to write in our previous example is grab the demographic data from our data sheet and copy it over to our form. So let's copy that code and let's write a new subroutine. We'll call it get demographics. Okay, so we now have a new subroutine that gets the demographics. Let's paste that code in here. So this is the same line of code we were using before. As you remember, only two things change: the source of the data and the destination. So we need to be able to tell our new subroutine, get demographics, that there are two things we want to change: the source and the destination. So we need to declare two variables, one for the source and one for the destination. Now, before, we've declared variables within our subroutine like this. However, in this scenario, because we want to pass in the variables into demographic, we want to pass in our source value and our destination value, we actually declare the variables within the brackets. So I will put here source as string, and I like my variables to start with capital letters. And I'll put a second variable, destination, also as string. And I don't use these two variables. What we then do is whatever value is passed into source, we want to use that in here to select the range in the data sheet. So I will pass in source, and then whatever value is assigned to destination, we want to use that in our exercises sheet to put the value in the destination. So that sets up our subroutine. This is now a subroutine that we can use over and over again instead of having to write one block of code for each item we want to copy. Now, instead, what we do is we go to our code for our subroutines, and then for hospital number, instead of writing the whole block of code, we just call our new subroutine, get demographics. And open bracket, and now demographics is asking us, well, what is the source and what is the destination? And if you remember, the source is A2 and the destination is C4. Okay, so now instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code, we've written a single line of code to get our hospital number. Let's run the code and see what we get. And as you can see, it gets the hospital number. And now for all the others, I need surname, forename, date of birth, height, and weight. So my surname comes from B2 and goes to C6. My forename comes from C2 and goes to C8. My date of birth comes from D2 and goes to C10. My height comes from E2 and goes to C12. And finally, my weight comes from F2 and goes to C13. And that should be 12. Okay, so let's run that code and see what we get. There we go. We've replaced our code that runs to fill the code without a subroutine, but having to repeat the block over and over again, with just a single line to fill each data item, but then using a subroutine. Now, if I later on make a change, I only have to change my subroutine. I don't have to change, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different blocks of code. I only have to change a single block. Next, let's take a look at functions. Now, the sub-procedure that we wrote and that we have used does its work, pastes the values in, but doesn't give us a result. You can't say what was the result of get demographic. But sometimes you want to get a result from your subroutine. Say, for instance, you might want to do a calculation, for instance, to calculate the BMI. In that situation, instead of writing a subroutine, we write a function. Functions are very similar in structure to subroutines, but there are some key differences. They start with the word function. They're given a name. You might put some values in bracket, what you want to pass in. In our case, we want to pass in the height. And you want to pass in the weight to calculate BMI. And then crucially, you have to have a result. So what you have to state what the data type is of your function. So your function returns, in my case, a single. Your function can return whatever you want it to return. It can return a calculated value, such as a single in this scenario. It can return Boolean logic, so true or false, or it can return a string. It can return whatever you want it to return. In my situation, I want the function to return the result of my BMI calculation. So I set the name of the function equal to, and I put the formula for BMI. Weight divided by height, raised to the power 2, and it depends on your units, but in my case, I have to multiply by 703. So this gets my BMI calculation. I can copy all the demographics as before. I'll declare a variable. So to calculate BMI, I will set my BMI equal to, and I'll use my function. calculate BMI, which is expecting a height, which I know I have copied into cell C12. So I'll use a range object to get the value of cell C12. And then for my weight, I'll also use a range object to get the value of cell C13. And that will give me my BMI. And with that, I can then select range C14. And with the selection object, set the value property to BMI. Okay, so in this example, we're using our subroutine to get all the demographics, and we're using our function to get the BMI. Let's run the code and see what we get. And as you can see, it's calculated our BMI and it's also copied over all of our demographics. So you can see now how powerful subroutines and functions are. You can use them to write small items of code which you can reuse in your bigger program. I hope you found that interesting and useful, and I will see you in the next video.